On the evening of November 6, 1989, federal agents believed they were listening for the language of politics, coded references to militant ties, conversations that might connect a St. Louis man to the Abu Nidal organization. But when they pressed play on the tape the next morning, what they heard was something far darker. Something no one in law enforcement had ever encountered before. The recording began with raised voices inside a small apartment at 37 feet 9 Delaware Avenue. A teenage girl, just home from her very first shift at Wendy's, was being confronted by her parents. The argument escalated. Then came the unmistakable sounds of a struggle. On the tape, the girl's voice pleaded, begged, resisted. Her words grew weaker with each moment. And then, chilling in its finality, came her father's voice. "Die, my daughter, die." There was no mistaking it. His wife, her own mother, was heard in the background, urging him on, holding their daughter down as the attack continued. Within minutes, the apartment fell silent. This was no ordinary homicide investigation. This was not a case built on witness testimony or fragments of forensic evidence. It was the only time in American criminal history that a domestic killing was captured in real time by an FBI surveillance microphone. A hidden wire, meant to record political secrets, had instead preserved the brutal murder of Palestina Tina Issa, a 16-year-old girl whose only crime was wanting to live life on her own terms. This is the story of Tina Issa. Welcome to the Crime Series. Before we begin, do us a quick favor. Drop your location and the time you're watching this in the comments. We want to know where you're tuning in from, because these stories matter everywhere. Like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a case. Palestina Zain Issa, known to everyone as Tina, was born on December 3, 1972, in the Brazilian state of Mato Grosso. She came into the world as the youngest child of Zain al-Abidin Hassan Issa and Maria Matias Issa, joining a family already in transition between cultures, faiths, and continents. Tina's three older sisters, Aziza, Fatima, and Soraya, were much older and had already left home by the time Tina reached her teenage years, leaving her in many ways the only child still under her parents' direct supervision. Her name, Palestina, was a deliberate choice. For her father, it carried deep symbolic weight, an homage to his homeland, a marker of his identity that he wanted carried into the next generation. From the beginning, Tina's life was shaped by the collision of worlds. A Palestinian father holding tightly to tradition, and a Brazilian mother who had grown up in an entirely different environment. Her father, Zain, had been born on June 3, 1931, in Beitin, a small farming village near Ramallah in the West Bank. The third son in a household bound by customs and honor, Zain grew up in a setting where family ties and obedience to elders were paramount. Like many young men of his generation, his early years were defined by hard work and rigid expectations. In his teens, he entered into marriage with his double first cousin, a practice common in his community and consistent with the cultural norms of preserving family alliances. By the 1950s, however, Zain's ambitions carried him beyond Beitin. Political unrest and economic pressures in the Middle East pushed many Palestinians to seek opportunities elsewhere. Following the pattern of several families from his village, Zain emigrated, eventually landing in Brazil, a country that at the time was experiencing growth and offered relative freedom for immigrant families. It was in Brazil that Zain's life veered in a new direction. On a trip to Rondonópolis, a regional hub in Mato Grosso, he met Maria Matias, a young woman born on August 10, 1943, in Santa Catarina, southern Brazil. Maria came from a very different background. She was of mixed Italian and indigenous ancestry, raised in a Roman Catholic family whose values, while strict, emphasized faith in a way far removed from Zain's Muslim upbringing. The attraction between Zain and Maria quickly led to marriage. On February 6, 1963, despite vocal objections from Maria's family, who saw their daughter entering into a union they did not approve of, she and Zain were wed. Only after the wedding did Maria discover that she was not his first wife. Zain admitted that he already had another spouse, a revelation that placed Maria in a secondary position from the very start of her married life. This disclosure set the tone for much of their relationship. where Maria's role would often be one of following Zayn's lead, rather than challenging it. The Issa family's early years were marked by near-constant relocation, as though they were never fully settled in one identity or one place. After their marriage, they moved frequently between Brazil, the United States, and even Puerto Rico, each move layering complexity onto the family's cultural makeup. They lived at different times in Rondonópolis and Cáceres in Brazil, as well as in Raleigh, North Carolina, Paterson, New Jersey, and Arecibo, Puerto Rico. Each transition meant new languages, new customs, and new pressures. Maria, fluent in Portuguese, carried her Catholic Brazilian roots with her. Zayn clung to Arabic, Palestinian customs, and the authority of tradition. Tina, meanwhile, absorbed it all. From her father, she learned Arabic. From her mother, Portuguese. From their years in Puerto Rico, she picked up Spanish. And when they returned to the United States, she mastered English as well. By adolescence, Tina was multilingual, a rare ability that symbolized the blend of identities she carried within her. But this mobility also created strain. In every place they lived, Tina had to adjust to new schools, new friends, and shifting expectations at home. The Issa family stood at the intersection of cultures, each move reinforcing the tension between Zayn's rigid worldview and Maria's quieter but loyal support of him. By the mid-1980s, when they settled permanently in St. Louis, Missouri, these cultural contrasts had already set the stage for conflict within the Issa household. For Tina, the constant movement and cultural layering meant she was never just one thing. She was Palestinian by name and heritage, Brazilian by birth and upbringing, and increasingly American by education and socialization. This diverse identity would one day become her strength. But within the Issa home, it also became a source of friction, a constant reminder that she was straddling worlds her parents did not always want her to embrace. By 1989, the Issa family had put down roots at 3759 Delore Avenue in South St. Louis, inside the Deller Park apartments. The complex was modest, brick buildings clustered together, filled with families from different walks of life. Many were recent arrivals to America, immigrants navigating new languages, customs, and opportunities while trying to hold on to their own traditions. For Tina Issa, this environment meant she was never far from the echoes of her parents' old world, even as she absorbed the rhythms of the new one just outside her door. From her earliest years, Tina had shown herself to be bright, curious, and unusually adaptable. Languages came to her almost as naturally as breathing. She spoke Arabic with her father, who wanted her firmly tied to his Palestinian roots. She spoke Portuguese with her mother, who carried the warmth of her Brazilian upbringing into their home. During the family's years in Puerto Rico, Tina had eagerly picked up Spanish, adding another thread to her cultural tapestry. By the time she entered her teens in St. Louis, she had added English, giving her fluency in 4 languages. For a girl her age, it was a rare gift, and it gave her the ability to move between communities in a way few of her peers could. At Dewey Junior High and later Roosevelt High School, Tina's personality shone. Friends described her as approachable and gentle, the kind of person who greeted others with a smile and carried herself with quiet warmth. She blended easily into the life of an ordinary 1980s teenager, chatting with friends in the hallways, sharing music, trading stories about after-school jobs or weekend plans. Her classmates saw her as kind and open-hearted, someone they enjoyed being around. But what her peers couldn't see was the sharp contrast between Tina's school life and her home life. Inside the Issa household, expectations were strict and non-negotiable. Her father, Zayn Issa, ruled with the authority of his upbringing, a man who had grown up in a tightly controlled Palestinian farming community and whose worldview had been hardened by politics and tradition. By the 1980s, Zayn's associations and ideological ties had drawn the attention of federal investigators. He was already under quiet scrutiny, a devout Muslim with connections that placed his household under a level of suspicion unknown to his teenage daughter's friends. Her mother, Maria, was equally influential in Tina's upbringing, though in a very different way. Raised in Brazil in a Catholic family with Italian and native ancestry, Maria had come from a background that embraced festivity, warmth, and openness. But after marrying Zine, she took on a role of deference. Rather than offering a counterbalance to his rigid authority, she aligned herself with him, reinforcing his commands even when they clashed with her daughter's needs. For Tina, this created a constant balancing act. On one side was the world of her friends, where individual freedom was celebrated, choosing clothes, picking music, deciding who to spend time with. On the other side was her home, where each of those same choices could be treated as a challenge to authority and a question of family honor. She was Palestinian through her father, Brazilian through her mother, and American by the culture she grew up in. Her lineage even included Italian, German, and indigenous ancestry, giving her a uniquely layered identity. Yet this richness came at a cost. In mid-1980s Missouri, a place where teenagers thrived on independence, Tina lived within strict boundaries that made even ordinary freedoms feel dangerous. Every decision, whether it was working outside the home, listening to popular music, or forming friendships, was scrutinized. What her classmates took for granted, Tina experienced as small acts of rebellion, moments that carried the risk of confrontation when she returned to Delaware Avenue. It was within this clash, between the freedom she tasted at school and the rules that governed her home, that Tina's short life unfolded. By the mid-1980s, the Isa household had become a place of unrelenting tension. The clash between tradition and the realities of American life created constant friction, and Tina was at its center. The struggle between her father's vision of discipline and her own desire for independence was no longer just a background issue. It was defining the daily atmosphere in the Isa family home. Outside her home, Tina Isa tried to create a different life for herself. In her mid-teens, she was stepping into the world of adolescence in St. Louis, and like many of her classmates, she wanted the freedom to explore music, friendships, and opportunities that came with growing up in America. One of her first steps toward independence was applying for a part-time job at Wendy's at Grand and Gravois. It was for a small role, but for Tina, it carried meaning far beyond a paycheck. It gave her responsibility, a sense of contribution, and most importantly, hours spent outside the close supervision of her household. Her parents weren't pleased. The job was viewed with suspicion. Zain Isa questioned the necessity of her working outside the home and worried about the influences she might encounter there. Maria questioned why she didn't prefer to work at the grocery shop owned by the family. To them, this was a sign that Tina was completely slipping out of their control. Music was another window into that independence. The mid-1980s were alive with Western pop culture, and Tina embraced the sounds that defined her generation. Popular songs offered her a connection to classmates, a reflection of her youth, and an escape from the restrictions she felt at home. For her, music was not just entertainment, it was a way of belonging, a reminder that she was part of something bigger than her family's narrow boundaries. Her friendships followed the same pattern. Tina gravitated toward peers who shared her interests in music, school, and the simple joys of teenage life. Friends who saw her as approachable and kind-hearted, someone who smiled easily but carried the quiet burden of her home life. To them, she was no different from any other teenager, full of curiosity, laughter, and dreams. But each of these steps, working, listening to music, spending time with friends, was also an act of quiet resistance against the rules of her household. As Tina leaned further into the life of a typical American teenager, the tension inside her family's home began to sharpen. What had once been small differences in outlook between tradition and independence were turning into direct conflicts. Every new step she took toward building her own identity outside the household seemed to draw an equally strong reaction from her parents. What most deeply troubled her parents, however, was her relationship with Cliff Walker, a young African-American man outside their race, cultural, and religious background. For Zain and Maria Isa, this relationship crossed boundaries they were unwilling to accept. Within their worldview, marriage and relationships were to be guided by family, tradition, and faith. Tina's decision to form an attachment on her own terms, especially with someone beyond those cultural expectations, was to them a serious challenge to authority. The conflicts did not go unnoticed. Friends at school recalled that Tina sometimes spoke about the restrictions at home and the arguments that followed her efforts to live more freely. If real cases and verified evidence matter to you, tap subscribe and turn on notifications. We break every case down into clear, sourced beats so you can follow the facts and draw your own conclusions. On the night of November 6, 1989, the conflicts that had been simmering for years inside the Issa household finally erupted into their most tragic and irreversible form. It was a night that should have been ordinary, even hopeful. It was Tina Issa's first day at work at the Wendy's on Grand and Gravois, a bustling corner of St. Louis, where fast food chains, small shops, and neon lights gave teenagers a taste of freedom and independence. For Tina, the job meant more than a paycheck. It was her first concrete step toward building a life of her own, outside her parents' watchful eyes. Before leaving home, Tina taped a small handwritten note to the door. "I'll be back by 11:30 p.m. It was a teenager's practical gesture, a message meant to reassure, or at least to set a boundary. When her shift ended that night, her boyfriend, Cliff Walker, offered to walk her home. Cliff knew the tensions that followed Tina into her household. His simple act of walking her back to Delaware Avenue was more than kindness, it was protection. By 11:59 p.m., the two reached the apartment door of the Issa family's unit. Cliff said goodnight. Tina stepped inside, and in that moment, the outside world lost its last glimpse of her alive. What followed behind closed doors was a confrontation that had been building for months. Inside the small living room of the apartment, her parents immediately raised the familiar accusations: her job, her friendships, her relationship with someone outside their faith and culture. To Zine and Maria Issa, these were not harmless teenage choices. They were symbols of rebellion, dishonor, and defiance against the authority they believed was absolute. The argument escalated quickly, voices rising to shouts. Then came the breaking point. Zane Issa, stern and immovable, launched into physical violence. Maria, who had once been raised in a different tradition but now stood firmly behind her husband, joined in. In those moments, the Issa household transformed from a place of ordinary family tension into the scene of an unthinkable betrayal. Tina's voice, crying for help, filled the walls. She struggled, resisted, and begged, but her parents' combined force overwhelmed her. As the struggle dragged on, her cries grew weaker, until finally her voice faded into silence. When it was over, Zine and Maria acted quickly to control the narrative. They called police and emergency services, reporting that their daughter had been attacked, presenting themselves as distraught parents rather than perpetrators. First responders arrived to find Tina lifeless, her body bearing the unmistakable marks of violence. At first glance, it appeared to be yet another brutal crime with no witnesses, a tragedy concealed by the privacy of four walls. But this was no ordinary homicide. What no one outside law enforcement knew at the time was that the Issa apartment had already been under federal surveillance. Months earlier, as part of a counterterrorism investigation, the FBI had installed a hidden microphone inside the Issa home. Zain Issa had come under suspicion for his connections to the Abu Nidal organization, a violent Palestinian faction that was one of the most active militant groups of the 1980s. Agents were hoping to capture conversations about foreign contacts or political plots, not domestic life, and certainly not a murder. Crucially, the surveillance was not monitored live. Recordings were stored and reviewed later. On the morning of November 7, 1989, an FBI agent sat down to review the tape from the previous night. What he heard stunned him to the core. Instead of political discussions, the tape captured something else entirely: the sounds of a teenage girl's final moments. The recording preserved everything: the raised voices as the argument began, Tina's desperate pleas as the confrontation escalated, the struggle as she fought to resist, and finally the chilling words of her father as her strength gave way. "Die, my daughter, die." Her mother's voice was also captured, urging Zain on and holding Tina down. There was no ambiguity, no guesswork, no speculation. The microphone, hidden for national security purposes, had inadvertently become the only witness to one of the most horrifying family murders in American history. For weeks leading up to that night, the surveillance had yielded little. Agents had logged fragments of daily life, mundane conversations, household routines, background noise. There was always the expectation that eventually something politically useful might surface. But nothing prepared them for what they actually captured on the night of November 6. Instead of evidence of international terrorism, they had uncovered undeniable proof of a domestic killing, one that unfolded in real time on their tape. For investigators, it was a moment of shock and clarity. Rarely, almost never, does law enforcement obtain an unbroken audio record of a homicide as it happens. In most cases, prosecutors rely on forensic reconstruction, circumstantial evidence, and testimony. But here, every word, every sound, every desperate cry was preserved on a federal tape. The Isa case would not only horrify the public, it would redefine the boundaries of how evidence could shape a trial. The microphone, installed for national security purposes, had inadvertently become the sole witness to one of the most disturbing crimes in U.S. history. What might have otherwise remained clouded in uncertainty was preserved in full detail. An unfiltered account of confrontation, resistance, and loss, recorded inside the Isa family's own home. This case stands out in American criminal history precisely because the crime was not pieced together after the fact by witnesses or forensic reconstruction. It was captured on tape by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, who had wired the Isa apartment for an entirely different reason. The agents who reviewed the tape were stunned. They had not anticipated capturing evidence of a domestic killing, let alone one so thoroughly documented. In U.S. criminal investigations, it is rare for law enforcement to obtain an unbroken audio record of a crime in progress. Here, by sheer circumstance, federal counterterrorism surveillance had produced precisely that. The recording quickly became the central piece of evidence. Unlike witness testimony, which can be challenged or disputed, the FBI's tape was an unaltered, minute-by-minute account of what happened inside the Isa apartment. It left little room for interpretation. Jurors would later hear the same chilling words that agents first encountered in their review, making the case unusually direct in its evidentiary strength. Following the crime, Zine and Maria Isa moved quickly to arrange their daughter's burial. The funeral was conducted in near secrecy, attended only by close family and members of their community. Friends and classmates were not invited, and there was no public service. The hurried nature of the burial raised questions even at the time, but because no outside authorities had yet intervened, the service proceeded quietly and without delay. Officers responded to the family's Delore Avenue apartment and opened a homicide investigation. Maria Isa gave an initial statement to police at the scene and later at the station. Following the FBI's alert and those interviews, both parents were taken into custody that day. Law enforcement officials understood the extraordinary nature of the evidence in their possession. Rarely, if ever, had a crime of this kind been captured so completely by federal surveillance. The audio left no ambiguity about what had occurred or who had been responsible. With the recording as their foundation, authorities quickly built the framework for charges of first-degree murder. Zine and Maria Isa were taken into custody in St. Louis. Neighbors who had long observed the Isa family were stunned when they saw police presence at the apartment complex. Many had known Tina as a polite, approachable teenager who smiled readily, but they were also aware of the strict household she lived in. The realization that her life had been taken in such a manner, and that her parents were now accused, sent shockwaves through the local community. For investigators, the arrest was both straightforward and sobering. The tape meant there was no need to rely on uncertain testimony or reconstruct events from fragmented evidence. They had, quite literally, the crime preserved on record. Yet this very fact deepened the sense of disturbance among agents and prosecutors. Listening to Tina's final moments on tape was harrowing, even for professionals accustomed to handling violent cases. One FBI agent later described the experience of hearing the words spoken by her father as unlike anything he had encountered in his career. News of the arrest quickly spread beyond the neighborhood. Local media outlets reported the unusual circumstances, a domestic crime uncovered not by eyewitnesses, but by federal surveillance intended for national security monitoring. The story stood out because it combined elements rarely seen together: international counterterrorism investigation on one side and a family tragedy on the other. Public reaction was immediate and intense. Many were horrified not only by the crime itself, but also by the knowledge that it had been preserved in real time on an FBI tape. The idea that a teenage girl's final moments were captured by government surveillance equipment shocked the conscience of St. Louis, and soon after, the nation. Investigators soon faced a practical challenge. Tina's body had already been buried by her family before police became directly involved. To meet legal requirements and confirm the cause of death, authorities obtained a court order to exhume her remains. The medical examiner's autopsy revealed multiple stab wounds, findings that aligned exactly with what was heard on the FBI recording. Although the tape had already provided irrefutable evidence, the autopsy gave the court an official forensic confirmation, strengthening the prosecution's case. When the trial of Zine and Maria Issa began in St. Louis, it quickly became clear that this would not be an ordinary case. Rarely had prosecutors walked into a courtroom with evidence as direct and damning as the FBI's surveillance tape. At the same time, the unusual circumstances under which that tape had been obtained gave the defense a narrow opening to challenge its admissibility and reliability. In addition to the audio recording, prosecutors presented the autopsy findings to establish the physical cause of death. The medical examiner testified that Tina had suffered 6 tightly clustered puncture wounds in the left breast and smaller pricks to the chest and neck. Tina had defensive cuts on her hands. The fatal blows pierced the heart and left lung, requiring great force, each consistent with the timeline and sounds preserved on the FBI tape. While the surveillance recording was the case's central piece of evidence, the autopsy provided scientific confirmation that supported the prosecution's narrative beyond any doubt. The prosecution's case was built around control, cultural conflict, and intent. They argued that Tina's parents saw her independence, her job, friendships, and relationship with a young man outside their traditions, as a betrayal of family honor. In their eyes, prosecutors claimed this was not an impulsive act, but a deliberate decision rooted in preserving authority. For the defense, each objection to the FBI's methods underscored how limited their options had become. They could not deny that the recording existed. Their only hope was to persuade jurors to question how it was obtained, or to humanize Maria in a way that separated her role from Zine's. As the trial continued, it became clear that this was more than a contest over facts. It was a clash between the irrefutable evidence of technology and the defense's attempts to frame a more sympathetic narrative. In that struggle, the jury was left to balance law, emotion, and the haunting sound of a daughter's final pleas, especially after Maria admitted that immediately after the killing, she grabbed Tina from behind, restraining her. On December 20, 1991, after hearing sentencing arguments, Circuit Judge Charles A. Shaw accepted the jury's recommendation and imposed death sentences on Zine and Maria Issa. "Culture is no excuse for murder," he said, adding that he saw no reason to deviate from the penalty the jury had returned. The ruling followed the jury's October 25, 1991 guilty verdicts for first-degree murder and its separate recommendation of death during the penalty phase. For jurors, the FBI surveillance tape had left little room for doubt. It captured not only the act itself, but also the words and roles of both parents, creating a level of certainty rare in criminal proceedings. The sentences reflected the severity of the crime. Zine Issa was given the death penalty, a decision that underscored the deliberate and brutal nature of his actions. Maria Issa, who had been heard on the tape assisting in urging her husband forward, also initially received a death sentence. However, her punishment was later commuted to life imprisonment, reflecting legal debates about her role and the extent of her responsibility under her husband's influence. Zine never lived to see his execution carried out. He died of complications from diabetes in prison in 1997, while still awaiting the final steps of the appeals process. Maria, whose death sentence was overturned, also died in prison on April 30, 2014. In memory of Palestina Tina Issa, Share this episode to raise awareness about hidden family violence. If you or someone you know needs help, talk to a trusted adult or local support line in your area. Earlier is safer.